Hi, everybody. This is David Nevins for Citybiz List. And today we continue with our series of interviews on behalf of the Bridge Alliance, which, as you know, has been called Fixing America's Broken Democracy. A little bit of work involved in that, folks. So anyway, today we have a very special guest. His name is Josh Silver, and he's the executive director of RepresentUs. US, Represent Us. Josh, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
It's our pleasure. And Josh, I know that, let me ask you first. Tell us a little bit first, I guess, about yourself. I know you have been involved in election and media reform for some time, and then shift gears and tell us a little bit about Represent Us.
Sure. So I have spent my life in my whole career in public interest advocacy. I'm a believer that in American society, there are two great issues, and they're sort of two sides of the same coin. One is our media system and having Americans with access to facts and information in order to be participants in democracy. And then there is democracy itself. And what is the structure of our democracy? And does it incentivize the election and empowerment of politicians who represent those people? And that's the fundamental existential question of our times. And most of the dysfunction we see in American government, particularly the gridlock, polarization, extremism, corruption, inability to move major issues like climate, education, infrastructure, all come back to these core structural issues.
I would tend to agree. So Josh, tell us a little bit about these. Let's get into the nuts and bolts. Tell us a little bit about these core structural issues. I know your organization is involved in election reform and gerrymandering and corruption and so forth. So sure. Tell us about your work and what you're trying to achieve.
So Represent Us was created about a decade ago out of an observation of a couple things. That one, that despite the fact that only about 25%, even less at the time, 25% of Americans self-identify as liberal, nearly the entirety of the democracy reform movement was decidedly liberal and progressive. But the other 75% of Americans who don't self-identify as liberal, by and large, support reforms to our democracy of the types you just mentioned. We also recognize that efforts to fix these problems with our democracy, with election law, campaign finance law, ethics laws, that they were and continue to be largely stuck in Washington, D.C., and that the solution is going into the states in the same way that the suffragettes did, the same way that marijuana advocates or gay marriage advocates all did, saying nothing's moving in Washington. We're going to take reform to the states and we're going to change it from the bottom up. So that hence was the birth of Represent Us, a fiercely nonpartisan organization bringing together conservatives and liberals, Republicans and Democrats to pass sweeping democracy reforms at the city and state level.
Josh, it does seem, I think you mentioned it's in some ways a bit of a conundrum, I guess, that I talk to my liberal friends, conservative friends, Democratic friends, Republican friends, and they, if you brought up things like gerrymandering, everybody thinks that's a terrible thing. We need to get rid of it. And term limits. So term limits is a good thing. We need to have that. And keeping money out of politics, that's a bad thing. And yet there just doesn't seem to be a lot of change. I spend half the year in Maryland, and you may or may not be aware, I'm told that in Maryland, the one Republican district that we have in the huge state of Maryland. I'm kidding. Maryland, as everybody knows, is one of the tiniest states, but one of our congressional districts is the longest congressional district geographically east of the Mississippi, just in order to make sure that almost everybody who's a Republican happened to live in that district. So where do we go from here, Josh? And what's your organization doing about it?
there's some good news, and that is that over the last decade, we have helped bring forward and pass over 100 city and state laws and resolutions in favor of the kinds of reforms that you've described, from creating independent and bipartisan commissions to end gerrymandering in 5 states in 2018 alone passed it via ballot initiative, to passing ranked choice voting now in 2 states, Maine and Alaska, in addition to more than a dozen cities that enjoy it across the country, to ethics and campaign finance reforms that have passed all across the country. We are actually seeing a quiet but potent and powerful sort of renaissance of democracy reforms sweeping the country at the city and state level. Now, in 2021, we have a very, very infrequent thing happening. It hasn't really happened at this scale since the Civil Rights Act, certainly, is the For the People Act, which is sweeping federal legislation that has passed the US House and is being considered by the US Senate. It's a direct response to the Trump administration, to the January 6th insurrection, to the voter suppression efforts by the sort of Trump authoritarian wing of the Republican Party. And there is a real possibility that that will pass. Still has a long way to go. We're in this rare window of federal reform. We also are about to see decennial or every 10-year gerrymandering happening, where at the end of every year that ends in a 1, this case 2021, every state in America is going to redraw their lines, like in Maryland. And that will set the table for another decade of what the districts look like at the state and federal levels. But after all of this hullabaloo, when it all ends, when the HR 1/For the People Act fight ends, when the decennial gerrymandering ends, fights that we're in, what's going to be left at the party is the long game of passing laws at the city and state level through legislative lobbying, through ballot initiatives that fundamentally change democracy laws, and with it, incentives. Because what people don't realize, David, is that gerrymandering, for example, people think of as a competition problem. It's actually as much of an extremism problem as anything, because in 88% of races for the US House, there is gerrymandering. There is no competition in the general election. The only competition is in the primary, where you can get primaried, where the most extreme voters vote in turnout.
Right. So our candidates are more worried about being attacked from the far left or the far right, and that, it seems to me, is why we don't have the most America identify as in the middle, and yet our politicians are not in the middle.
Exactly. The same goes for ranked choice voting, which would allow independent and third-party candidates to run without being spoilers, and has proven to moderate elections and make it so that the more consensus candidate, not the extremists like a Donald Trump, get elected. So these are the kinds of fundamental, unsexy laws that are starting to propagate all across the country. Many of them, most of them, are in the For the People Act. So if it passes federally, it's a game changer. But these are the kind of laws that are starting to pass across the country. And if we are successful, we, Represent Us, will continue to do what we're doing well, which is seeding these laws early out in the cities and states, making sure that they win, and then making sure that they're implemented and protected.
Tell us a little bit about actually how ranked choice voting, since you mentioned it, how does that work? So you said it's passed now in Alaska and Maine. So what does that mean if one is running for governor of the state? How does it work?
It's very simple. When you go to vote, you will see on your ballot a slate of candidates. You are asked not to just pick one. You're asked to vote for your first choice and your second choice and even your third choice. They tally up the votes. If one candidate gets more than 50% of first place votes, they win. It's over. If there is no candidate who gets more than 50% of first place votes, which is usually the case when you have a multi-candidate race,
right,
the lowest scoring candidate is instantly eliminated, and everybody who voted for that person, their second place vote is applied to the remaining candidates. And that process continues until somebody gets more than 50% of the vote by being reallocated votes from the losing candidates. It's a brilliant system that makes it so that you can vote for the person you actually want without worrying that you're going to inadvertently be helping the person you hate the most and or throwing your vote away. And more importantly, it incentivizes better candidates, say candidates who don't want to deal with the BS associated with running as a mainstream Republican or a mainstream Democrat, or they want to just be an independent. They can run and win without fearing that they're just going to spoil the race for others.
Well, I hope that advances for sure. Josh, I know you're also involved in anti-corruption laws and promoting those. Give a couple of examples of what that is.
Well, there's a few. You mentioned one yourself. We favor 18-year term limits, which is pretty reasonable. It says you could be a 6-term U.S. senator, or you could have 9 terms in the U.S. House. But at a certain point, it's probably better for you to step aside. I mean, I have a hard time finding anybody who wants to defend having these people in office who have been there for 30, 40 years, and the kind of corruption and sort of institutionalism that sort of takes over people who have been there too long. The revolving door, so closing, or currently over 50% of the members of the U.S. Congress leave office, they leave public service, and they become 7-figure paid lobbyists on K Street. You can pass laws that make that illegal and say you have to have a 5-year cooling off period between public service and being a lobbyist. You can pass campaign finance laws like what's in the For the People Act, which creates publicly funded campaigns. You can do it like they've done with the federal legislation that says, and further, it won't increase taxes. It'll come from a pool of money levied fines on white collar criminals. So there's a lot of creative ways to increase ethics. Another one, frankly, is just getting the president to be mandatory revealing of their tax returns, or just simply enforcing ethics laws, which we saw during the Trump administration were routinely ignored, and there was no enforcement. Making sure that the Department of Justice cannot be used as a tool of the executive office. These are all changes that can be made by changing the law.
Yeah, Josh, I think actually you meant to say you can be a 3-term U.S. senator. I think you might have said 6-term.
Yeah, sorry, 3-term U.S. senator,
9-term
congressman.
No, that's I got it. You were right on the Congress side. Let me ask you this. It's fascinating to me how Congress as a whole, when people talk about the job that Congress is doing, it ranks pretty low in terms of public approval. But yet everybody loves their congressman or woman, or at least the overwhelming majority get reelected and reelected. How do you deal with that? Because I think early on in our discussion, you talked about the media and their role in all of this as well.
Well, first of all, I don't want to mince words here. People don't love their member of Congress. They just like them a lot more than they like Congress generally, which is different. Now, the problem is that when you've got between 86 and 88% of congressional races, the outcome is predetermined. It's a gerrymandered district, or it's such a heavily skewed district. There's no way in the current broken system that an opposing candidate can actually win. What's happened is people are rightfully kind of like given up. Like, for example, I live in Massachusetts. My state has 9 congressional seats, and they're all Democrats, even though more than 35% of the voters in Massachusetts are Republicans. So it's been so gerrymandered. There is no choice for my member of Congress. It's predetermined, It's predestined. So if we can introduce competition, both by mitigating gerrymandering, so we stop manipulating the district lines, and introducing ranked choice voting and open primaries, which actually makes them more competitive as well, then everything changes. The whole calculation changes, and we get away from this sort of mediocrity that has led to this system failure, which it should be noted, like what happened on January 6th. This is the direct result of 2 main drivers. One, digital misinformation. and the cooptation on social media where propaganda has now trumped facts. And so you had all these people attacking the US Capitol based on a completely alternate and false reality of perception of what's happening in the world, like the election was stolen. And then the second thing are these democratic structural issues, small d, that are incentivizing corruption, incentivizing extremism, and incentivizing the election of extremists like Donald Trump. Now, I am not a Democrat. I am not a liberal, but I am someone who believes that the system needs to represent everybody, and the current system conspires to represent billionaires, special interests, and the most extreme voters. And until that changes, we are going to continue our spiral into the kind of extremism that we saw on January 6th. We could very well see the authoritarian wing of the Trump sort of Republican Party win the House next year, win the White House in 2024. And if that happens, it will be an even more destabilizing event than we saw over the past 12 months.
Yeah, I think there's no question about it. I talk to my friends, and personally, I think if we could fix two things, gerrymandering and term limits, that our government would overnight look very different. Josh, just before we part ways, obviously you're doing fascinating work, and I send kudos and wish you luck. But tell us how many of our viewers can contact you and or get involved with Represent Us.
Very easy. You just did it for me. Go to Represent Us. That's represent.us on the web. Sign up to volunteer, sign up to donate. We can't do it without financial supporters. Get involved, send us questions, whatever. But if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. And that is true for American democracy in 2021 more than any other issue.
Thank you very much, Josh. Our guest today has been Josh Silver, the Executive Director of Represent Us. And this is David Nevins on behalf of the Bridge Alliance and their series on fixing America's broken democracy, and also on behalf of Citybiz List. Josh, thank you for joining us.
You bet. Thank you.